And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
Go ahead.
Sure. No, Mr. President-elect.
Go ahead.
Mr. President-elect, since you are attacking our news organization, can you give us a chance?
Your organization.
You are attacking our news organization. Can you give us a chance to ask a question, sir?
Go ahead.
Sir, can you state, Mr. President-elect,
go ahead.
Can you state categorically,
she's asking a question.
Mr. President-elect, can you give us a question?
Don't be rude.
You're attacking us. Can you give us a question?
Don't be rude.
Can you give us a question?
I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
Sir.
News outlets get to go on day after day and cite unnamed sources, use stories without sources, have, you mentioned the Scaramucci story where they had to have reporters resign.
Come on, you're inflaming everybody right here, right now with those words. This administration has done that as well. Why in the name of heavens? Any one of us, right, are replaceable, and any one of us, if we don't get it right, the audience has the opportunity to turn the channel or not read us.
I think
you have been elected to serve for 4 years at least. There's no option other than that. We're here to ask you questions.
Right.
You're here to provide the answers. And what you just did is inflammatory to people all over the country who look at it and say, see, once again, the president is right and everybody else out here is fake media. And everybody in this room is only trying to do their job.
Welcome to the Newsbeat Podcast, where we examine critical issues of social justice. Each episode features interviews with prominent writers, educators, thought leaders, and activists, and is infused with original music and verses from independent artists. The Newsbeat Podcast, the New York Times Podcast Club Pick of the Week in January 2018, and featured podcast on Best of the Left. Here's your host, Manny Faces.
Hey everybody, this is Manny Faces, producer and host of Newsbeat, where we combine journalism and original music to tackle the most critical social justice issues facing the world today. Welcome to another episode. We're brought to you once again by Maury Creative Studios, a New York-based inbound marketing and sales retention platinum HubSpot partner agency. You can check them out at maurycreative.com. Now, for obvious reasons, this episode hits home. Freedom of the press, protected by the First Amendment, forms the very bedrock of democracy. A free press ensures the government is accountable to the people and not the other way around. It holds officials, corporations, and institutions to their words and deeds and serves as a crucial check on those with their hands on the levers of power. It exposes wrongdoing in the public good and, as we like to say here at Newsbeat, shines a light to illuminate those actions and truths that some would otherwise keep in the shadows. And in fact, a great many journalists are killed in that very pursuit. I can go on and on. I love journalism. As you could tell from watching any White House press briefing these days or simply scrolling through your Twitter feed, journalism and these coveted press freedoms are currently under attack, increasingly here in the United States, supposedly the very beacon of freedom and democracy for the world. Now, this is nothing new. The US government has a long and sordid history of keeping secrets from its citizenry, but we're presently amid what many experts would characterize as an unprecedented assault on the Fourth Estate. One the power elite is waging on a daily basis to delegitimize and effectively erode its means and very function. This is not a Democratic or Republican thing either. They're both guilty, whether by cracking down on leakers and whistleblowers who pass along information, as President Obama infamously has done, or labeling unflattering stories fake news and journalists enemies of the American people, as Trump continues to do. What they're really seeking to destroy is the people's most lethal weapon, knowledge. The power to question and challenge their guaranteed right to the truth. When that's gone, well, it's no longer quite a democracy anymore, now is it? Detailing this current war on journalism and press freedom for us, and emphasizing just what's at stake, is John Kiriakou, a former CIA analyst turned whistleblower, imprisoned for exposing the illegal Bush-era torture program.
I just had no idea how obsessed with leaks Barack Obama was. And I had no idea what a militant Eric Holder was on the issue of national security leaks.
Barrett Brown, an award-winning journalist and founder of the online anti-injustice civic ecosystem Pursuance Project, who spent 4 years in prison for crowdsourcing an investigation into the U.S. cyber-industrial complex, among other things.
Every administration of the last 3 administrations has in different ways undermined the press's ability to do its business in very different ways.
Margot Ewan, executive director at Reporters Without Borders North America.
I think it gives the repressive governments green light, either to keep doing what they've been doing or to step up what they were doing kind of in small instances, maybe hoping the US wouldn't notice.
And Trevor Timm, co-founder and executive director of the nonprofit Freedom of the Press Foundation.
The Obama administration prosecuted more leakers and whistleblowers than all other administrations combined. And this really is not ancillary to press freedom rights. It's directly affecting press freedom rights.
Our musical guest this episode, Newsbeat's very own artist in residence, hip-hop recording artist, Silent Night. All right, here we go. This is Enemy of the American People, the U.S. government's war on journalism and press freedom.
In the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, I was the CIA's chief of counterterrorism operations in Pakistan. And in that capacity, I led a series of raids in Faisalabad, Pakistan in March 2002 that resulted in the capture of Abu Zubaydah, who the CIA believed at the time was the number 3 in Al-Qaeda. Abu Zubaydah was the first high-value target that we captured post 9/11. He was taken to a secret prison, the location of which has been reported in the press but is still classified, so I can't mention it here. When I returned to headquarters in the early summer of 2002, a senior Counterterrorism Center, CTC, officer approached me and asked me if I wanted to be certified in the use of enhanced interrogation techniques. These were his words. I had never heard that term before. And so I asked him what he meant. He got very animated and said, "We're going to start getting rough with these guys." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And then he delineated for me these 10 techniques. And I said, "That sounds like a torture program." The CIA did everything to him that you can imagine, from beating him to starving him to waterboarding him and subjecting him to sleep deprivation, keeping him for 2 weeks in a small dog cage. He had an irrational fear of insects, and they dumped in a box full of cockroaches on top of him just to make him crazy. It was torture by any definition of the word. I kept my mouth shut, though. I complained certainly internally, but not formally, because my chain of command created the torture program. But I kept my mouth shut. I resigned from the CIA in 2004 to take a position in the private sector, and finally, in 2007, I got a call from Brian Ross of ABC News. Brian said that he had a source who said that I had tortured Abu Zubaydah. I said that was absolutely untrue. I said, "Your source is either misinformed or he's a liar." And so in December 2007, I gave an interview to Brian at ABC News in which I said 3 things. I said that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. I said that torture was official U.S. government policy. It was not the result of a rogue CIA officer, as President Bush had said. And third, I said that the policy had been personally approved by the president himself. As you can imagine, within 24 hours, the FBI began investigating me. Then in January of 2012, I was arrested by the FBI, and I was charged with 5 felonies coming out of that original interview, including 3 counts of espionage. Now, espionage is one of the gravest crimes with which an American can be charged, and in many cases, it carries with it the death penalty.
Well, he was the only single person tried or jailed in the CIA torture scandal. No, he wasn't the mastermind behind it. He wasn't the chief interrogator or the lead torturer. He was the man who blew the whistle. John Kiriakou, a 14-year veteran of the CIA, the first person in 27 years to be convicted of violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. On February 28th of 2013, he reported to prison to serve a 30-month sentence.
Blowing the whistle on a program like torture is not an easy decision. It's not something that you can just do on a lark.
For a long time now, there's been too much secrecy in this city. The old rules said that if there was a defensible argument for not disclosing something to the American people, then it should not be disclosed. That era is now over. Starting today, every agency and department should know that this administration stands on the side not of those who seek to withhold information, but those who seek to make it known.
I will say I was taken aback by the government's response. I did not think I had committed a crime. I just had no idea how obsessed with leaks Barack Obama was. And I had no idea what a militant Eric Holder was on the issue of national security leaks.
The Obama administration prosecuted more leakers and whistleblowers than all other administrations combined. And this really is not ancillary to press freedom rights. It's directly affecting press freedom rights. You know, the only way that journalists and reporters can get information to the public is if they have sources within the government that can feel safe getting it to them. What this crackdown on whistleblowers has done is really chilled the investigative journalism space, especially in national security, where sources are now terrified to talk to reporters. And that is a real problem when we couple that with the extreme secrecy system that we have in this country, where everything in foreign policy and national security is considered classified.
Freedom of press, imperative to our preservation, contrary to whatever the president is saying. I thought that was a self-evident statement, but face it, I've been proven wrong on several occasions. Depressing, how depreciated the press is, really is precious. Really the pressures of the responsibility to report what's pressing, to preserve integrity of the First Amendment. That's a death wish. We accept it, but it shouldn't be. These are the medians who talk for those who couldn't speak. These are the warriors, the voice of all the slaughtered and the imprisoned, risking their lives to get our stories heard. They go to war for words, heavily armed, ready and willing to defend against harm. It's for the people, a centerpiece, not the enemy, a shining light in infantry, essentially.
I was a fairly conventional journalist for most of my 20s, and then by 2010 or so, I'd become disenchanted with the structures that exist around that, as in I didn't think it was any longer sufficient to just report on things, because, you know, obviously our civics is predicated on the idea that, you know, these things get reported and then somebody does something about them. Now that requires a certain kind of citizenry and requires a certain kind of legislature, and we tend not to have those things. And so I was experimenting with different ways of trying to improve journalism at first. I was creating little networks for some of the better bloggers out there back in the day to get their more important stories acknowledged by the larger megaphones of the press, of the major press outlets, and then veered into citizen collaboration and then anonymous. That fascinated me, what they were capable of doing. Anonymous, you know, which was a very amorphous group centered around a couple of different venues, first 4chan, then a couple of IRC networks and forums, that kind of thing, had become a very sort of a wild card, an interesting force. They were able to bring on large numbers of people very quickly and integrate their ideas on how things can be approached, and then get those ideas implemented immediately. This seems to sort of speak of the potential of the internet and of online collaboration, and of what it means that anyone can now all of a sudden, for the first time in history, collaborate with pretty much anyone else, theoretically.
We turn to investigative reporter Barrett Brown, who recently completed a 4-year prison sentence related to the hacking of the private intelligence firm Stratfor, which exposed how the firm spied on activists on behalf of corporations. At one point, Brown faced 100 years in prison before pleading guilty to lesser charges, including transmitting threats accessory to a cyber attack and obstruction of justice. Supporters say Brown was unfairly targeted for investigating the highly secretive world of private intelligence and military contractors. In 2009, Barrett Brown created Project PM, which was, quote, dedicated to investigating private government contractors working in the secretive fields of cybersecurity, intelligence, and surveillance. One of the first things he discovered was a plan to tarnish the reputations of WikiLeaks and the journalist Glenn Greenwald, who would later win a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden.
About a month after I got involved, it turned out we had been surveilled by this company called H.B. Gary, which is one of many, many firms we call intelligence contracting firms. These are private firms that do business both with the U.S. government and governments abroad and with private companies, and they provide them a number of services and products, including sort of black espionage services, things that would be illegal if you or I did them, but which are de facto legal because they're doing them. These bizarre circumstances were such that this guy who ran this company sort of challenged Anonymous online, or claimed that he had discovered its secret leadership and put out this information that was not correct. He went to the Financial Times and talked about this. And the next day, Anonymous hacked all of his stuff and stole all of his emails. And that email cache turned out to reveal a great deal about what the DOJ and what the FBI and what these private companies, including Booz Allen Hamilton, that are kind of extensions of the state right now, what they're doing in secret. And that was a huge deal for a lot of us, and that's what I pursued for the next year or so. We pursued it well enough that the FBI came down very hard on a lot of us. I was one of several who would be eventually arrested about a year after these revelations occurred.
The Barrett Brown case is probably one of the most significant threats to press freedom that has happened in the United States in the last, I would say, 2 decades at least. And it's received remarkably little attention in the mainstream press because they only pay attention when they themselves are attacked. We spend very little time talking about the real threats to press freedom because they happen to people like Barrett Brown rather than to MSNBC and the New York Times.
Every administration of the last 3 administrations has in different ways undermined the press's ability to do its business in very different ways. The Bush administration was just very adept at manipulating, taking advantage of the inefficiencies of the press to present an otherwise indefensible agenda, an otherwise indefensible conduct, just failures that, had they been not as well presented to the press, would have resulted in impeachment, in an extreme case. Barack Obama was different in that he was someone who had a lot of goodwill going in. And just as always been the case in American politics, where a Republican can do certain things like Nixon can go recognize China, and Bill Clinton can pursue welfare reform, because Nixon's a Republican, you don't expect a Republican to do that, and Clinton's a Democrat, and so on. That means that the Obama administration was actually well positioned to impinge upon the ability of the press to do its job, because they did have that goodwill that helps to facilitate that. It helped to make it seem like less of an extreme thing than it was. Now we have Trump, whose job is to maintain a constituency that is immune to facts and is immune to investigation and condemnation. And that's a very different animal that we're dealing with.
Fake news is a household term now. We not even half a term down. And yet it's looking like the world gon' burn down. I'm worried. He tweeting out the words that's heard round the planet. Immortalized but fact proof. Why should I even bother to have my story be backed by truth? The powerful ain't worried, they got more to make. Their fortune's safe, they already on their 4th estate. Of course that makes the smaller bait's fate seem sorta gravely, especially when they're reporting sense and I play it safely. I'm talking more than bravery, something they swore maybe. And then I writing about puff pieces and pastries. When you water down the merit, expect erosion. And when you yelling at an avalanche, then you get snowed in. And when you rising and they threaten you into disclosing, you start to question the direction that we're going.
I think the general idea is that the public does respect their press and that institution of journalism in their country. I think that what's going on here in the US, there was already a problem before the election, but I think it's really was tapped into by President Trump during his election. He really played to that underlying distrust and kind of amplified it. And so now it's really much of a bigger problem and it needs to be addressed, because the relationship between Trump bashing the press and then the press that kind of pushes back and says, no, actually we are just doing our job, but then their coverage is very aggressive and fact-based, and sometimes people are portraying that as just being negative coverage all the time. There has to be a distinction drawn between the way Trump uses the term and the actual concept of false information, and then also distinguish that from propaganda. So people that are sitting on their computer and actually churning out stories of innuendo that really have nothing to do with fact, that's what we're typically referred to as fake news.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake. A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are. They are the enemy of the people.
And the way Trump is using the term is literally to label any media outlet or any journalist or any story that's unfavorable to him, or that he just doesn't like the story because it's a critical story. That's his fallback accusation.
Because they have no sources, they just make them up when there are none. I saw one story recently where they said 9 people have confirmed. There are no 9 people. I don't believe there was 1 or 2 people. 9 people. And I said, give me a break, because I know the people. I know who they talk to. There were no 9 people, but they say 9 people. And somebody reads it and they think, oh, 9 people, they have 9 sources. They make up sources.
I think it gives the repressive governments green light, either to keep doing what they've been doing or to step up what they were doing kind of in small instances, maybe hoping the US wouldn't notice. And then when the US does make statements, because sometimes statements come out of the State Department that are very strong and condemn, for example, I think there was a Wall Street Journal reporter who does live here in the US, but she was sentenced to prison in Turkey in absentia. And I think there was a very strong statement coming out of the State Department condemning that decision. But when you have that statement and then a week later, 2 weeks later, the president calling for the revoking of media licenses, I think that sends a really mixed signal to these foreign governments and these authoritarian leaders who want to crack down on the press and actually who do have countries where they control the media licenses based on loyalty to the political party that's in power.
Go ahead.
Sure. No, Mr. President-elect.
Go ahead.
Mr. President-elect, since you are attacking our news organization, can you give us a chance?
Your organization
You are
is
attacking our news organization. Can you give us a chance to ask a question, sir?
Go ahead.
Sir, can you state,
Quiet.
Mr. President-elect,
Go ahead.
can you state categorically,
She's asking a question. Don't
Mr.
be rude.
President-elect, can you give us a question?
Don't be
You're
rude.
attacking us. Can you give us a question?
Don't be rude.
Can you
No,
give
I'm
us
not
a
going to give you a
question?
question. I'm not going to give you a
Can
question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
Sir,
go ahead.
Can you state categorically that nobody... No, Mr. President-elect, that's not appropriate.
I think press freedom in the United States is really complicated. You know, on one hand, the First Amendment is still alive and fairly well, which means that newspapers do have the freedom to basically publish what they want without being censored, which is a very important thing that we shouldn't forget, that almost all countries don't have something like the First Amendment, and it does allow newspapers to publish this type of information where they could be prosecuted in other countries. But at the same time, the government attacks them from all sorts of different angles, not related to the actual publishing. So they'll go after the leakers or the whistleblowers and the sources. They'll conduct surveillance on journalists.
The Associated Press says that the U.S. Justice Department has been secretly monitoring them for over 2 months. During that time, the DOJ collected telephone records of reporters and editors at the AP. The Associated Press called this, quote, a massive and unprecedented intrusion into how news organizations gather the news.
In some cases, they'll even subpoena them to force them to testify or try to force them to testify. And now we're seeing with Trump this kind of daily barrage of insults that he's throwing at the press to try to delegitimize what they report about him so that no one will believe it.
If you want to discover the source of the division in our country, look no further than the fake news and the crooked media, which would rather get ratings and clicks than tell the truth.
And so these are certainly attacks on the general principles of press freedom and are very concerning, especially when you, over the long run, where these newspapers, especially with them financially hurting, can be kind of run into the ground by this constant legal and public pressure that they face from government officials. While I think that it's in many ways, the U.S. still has the most vibrant and free press in the world, there are many other ways where these rights are being eroded, and it's important for the public to be aware that these rights are not just for journalists, they're for everyone. We receive information through these journalists as a conduit, and it is a really important safety valve of democracy that we don't want to lose.
Claim you love joy but promote hate. Oh, it's only okay if it's home base. If it's a foe, they go ruthless and that has no place. But right here, you don't like someone, license revoked today. Open season if you don't toe the line. No shield laws, decline, motion denied. Oh, so you silencing the folks that's already quiet. That's not just petty, but it's damn near violent. Hypocritical men, criticize and condemn. Demonize dictators, but legitimize them. Finger on the bomb trigger, but still scared of a pen. His leg is to get within, I'm not here to pretend. Careful with the type of mixed signals you send. There's blood on the ink, it could give life or it could shed. It can set an example, or trample and oppress, or be a shining light in this mess.
The Newsbeat podcast is owned by Newsbeat, Inc. Visit us at usnewsbeat.com. The producer and host of Newsbeat is Manny Faces. Our editor-in-chief is Christopher Towarski. Newsbeat's managing editor is Rashed Mian. The executive producer of Newsbeat is Jed Morey. Our podcast and website are co-produced and managed by Morey Creative Studios. Newsbeat relies on listener support and grants. Artists that appear on the podcast are compensated for original material. To support Newsbeat or contribute to our Artist-in-Residence program, visit us at usnewsbeat.com and click on Support. Subscribe to Newsbeat by Morey Creative Studios wherever you download your podcasts by searching for Newsbeat.